to the Trailblazers. I'm Perry Rarick, your host. The purpose of this interview series is to share with you interesting discussions I have with trailblazing thought leaders. They look at problems differently, they focus on solutions, and they're not afraid to challenge the status quo. Joining me on the Trailblazers this morning are Dan Sullivan and Nero Haralalka from TBM Consulting Group. Let me tell you a little bit about these two gentlemen. Dan has been a trusted advisor at TBM for over 30 years. He previously served as executive vice president and partner and is now transitioning to an advisory role where he focuses on helping clients with strategic initiatives, coaching internal and external teams, and supporting business development efforts. He also runs a management boot camp for TBM's leadership development programs. I think you'd be Drill Sergeant Dan in that respect. Dan is well known for helping companies establish leadership and management systems that support sustainable high performance, implement lean business systems, drive cultural change, and align continuous improvement initiatives with key strategic objectives. Nero has extensive experience in operational excellence and process improvement, including significant contributions to the pharmaceutical, laboratory, and healthcare sectors. As a Lean Six Sigma Master Black Belt with 35 years experience, Nero has led enterprise-wide transformations. In the pharmaceutical industry, he's worked with companies like Genzyme, Formulated Solutions, Steris, Alexion, Path, and Soltis Labs, now part of Quest Diagnostics. His expertise in complex statistical analysis and problem solving have made him a valuable asset in addressing the intricate challenges faced by life sciences organizations. Gentlemen, welcome to the Trailblazers.
Thanks, Barry.
Thank you,
Happy to be
Barry.
here.
Thanks for having us.
Well, this is very exciting. I've been looking forward to this all week. And so we're going to have a good time here. So the life sciences industry faces a lot of challenges and complex challenges. And all of these things, any one of them, but a combination of them can certainly stand in the way of business success. Long product development cycles, managing numerous and complex outsourcing relationships with CDMOs and CROs, a lot of venture capital activity, and frequent merger and acquisitions. And then, of course, a strict regulatory environment. However, and this isn't something we often speak about in this industry, sometimes they're not achieving success because of things that are well within their control. And perhaps some of these problems they've created. And that's where you gentlemen come in and help them. So coincidentally, I read the cover feature of Harvard Business Review, the latest one, and it is coincidentally titled "The Power of Strategic Fit." It's written by a couple gentlemen from Bain & Capital, Errol Rigby and Zach First. And I want to read something. This is how they describe the current state of strategy. And I'm going to ask your thoughts on this. Facing heavy pressure to improve worth of their company, many managers have turned to what we call spreadsheet strategies. That's quote unquote. They set financial goals sufficient to meet analysts' expectations and then fill in row by row, column after column, tweaking the numbers to find a plan that appears plausible and then backing their way to achieve it. And they describe this as a flawed approach. Is that a flawed approach?
Yeah, well, Perry, let me start with that one. I think, first of all, let me agree with the gentleman that had written the HBR article for you. Certainly it's flawed. There's a couple of things that come to mind as I think about that. When you say backed into, I have to think about getting on the interstate and actually going in reverse and seeing how effectively we could migrate at 65 and 70 miles an hour, all of us driving in reverse, looking through our rearview mirrors. It's not terribly safe, nor is it terribly effective. The second thing is the notion of reacting to an hopeful outcome is not really the way to make a plan. It has to be a proactive and methodical step of processes that enable an organization to get from point A to point B effectively. So I wholeheartedly agree with the notion that that's a very flawed approach.
And how often, Nero, how often do you run in what was described by those authors and what was endorsed by Dan?
I think, what typically happens, Barry, that when the client first engages with us, they are having some sort of an operational issue. And with that, they're not meeting their EBITDA, their earnings are not uh, supporting their plans. So they come to us with that. And as TBM engages with them and we help them with that, they soon realize that now that their operations is in order, their other business processes like the sales process, their supply chain, tech transfers, and things like that are not working. So then they say, okay, what do we need to do? And then the strategy deployment piece comes in as well. So that's how it evolves, right? That's the evolution with a client that's struggling to meet their financial goals.
That's an interesting explanation. I think what you described where there's some symptoms out there. They may think that they've got operational dysfunction, but it's typically much bigger than that.
Much bigger than
Measures. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Uh, awesome. So Dan, I'm going to ask you to describe something that we previously spoke about, the Hoshin strategic process. Can you offer a Hoshin 101? What is this thing?
sure. Yeah, well, let me do that if I can, Perry. Hoshin, by the way, for your listeners, Hoshin is actually translated from Japanese into English, policy or plan. So in the Western cultures, what we've taken is the Hoshin planning process, and we've talked about building a plan on a page, if you will. But the thing that needs to be most clear to your listeners about the Hoshin process is that it is an execution process as opposed to a visioning or strategic thinking process. Now, we do require strategic thought to set forth tactical steps, but in fact, it is in order to accomplish what it is we are hopeful of becoming by way of a strategic plan. So, the first piece of clarity is the Hoshin process is intended to provide a mechanic or a mechanics to enable an organization, diverse and dysfunctional, and any other things that are necessary, to pull that all together and actually create a pragmatic plan in order to better, more hopefully execute both mid-range and long-range plans effectively.
And Nero, the first time I talked to you, you talked about this disconnect between planning and execution, and then execution is where typically a lot of the problems are. And I think that's what you described by when there's an operational problem. That's usually the execution of something.
Yes, I think as I mentioned earlier, um, we start with when we say execution, it's not just having metrics and staying with those metrics, but actually taking action to achieve those metrics. So we need to have a process by which we review those metrics on a regular basis, and when we have some action plans to support the achievement of those metrics. And when we don't meet those metrics, it's equally important to think back and say, what caused us not to meet those objectives, right? And come up with the reaction plan to course correct immediately, right? Rather than wait till the end of the year to find out that shoot, we didn't meet the objectives.
So it's brilliant. Yeah. How often do we just wait to the next quarter or annually, God forbid, annually to make an adjustment? Really, really smart stuff. Dan, I'm going to come back to you and have you talk about something which sounds like the next superhero movie, the X Matrix. Okay, so this is a great tool. If
Right.
perhaps if I don't want to take your words away, but if you can talk about that, and as you're describing, excuse me, as you're describing what this is, I'm going to bring it up, the image you sent
Sure.
me, and we'll take a look at this as you talk about it.
Sure. Well, let me first step back and give you a little basis for the X matrix development. It's been around now some 70 plus years, if I can recall the dates, but it was an academic gentleman in Japan. His name was Fukuda. And he set about a study to understand what is it that made businesses seemingly more successful over time than many other companies. In other words, the cream was rising to the top, so to speak, over and over and over again, in spite of business cycles, economic conditions, headwinds, tailwinds, etc. And he was really puzzled and he wanted to ponder what were the circumstances that made some companies, a small percentage, much more successful over time than others. And really, as he said about his case study development, what he really concluded was not really what made them successful. He concluded what he called 4 fundamental things that made them likely to be unsuccessful over time. And those were the 4 lack ofs, LACKOFS, lack ofs. And let me paraphrase those for you so that you can understand the basis for the X matrix. The first 2 are what I call leadership behavioral lack ofs. And the first one is lack of organizational alignment on the goals of the corporation. So a lack of alignment, which I believe is behavioral. The second one is a general lack of commitment to the goals that have been set forth for the company or the organization. So those 2, I think, are leadership elements around the behavior of how they express it, how they commit to it, how they behave around it. The next 2 are more technical in nature and more meaningful, I think, from solution sets, and that's the lack of time in order to accomplish big things. The lack of time to do things is a significant issue, and also the lack of resources to accomplish things. So if you think about the 2 leadership behaviors, they manifest themselves into an outcome of real loss or absence of the ability to accomplish. And that's what Fukuda concluded. So therefore, he constructed, with a lot of trial and error, what we now call the infamous or famous X matrix that you have displayed for your audience here. And let me describe it really around the clock, if you will, the quadrants. And we begin at the south. If you imagine your road maps here, get to the south and you'll see a header called 3 to 5 year breakthrough objectives. And what we typically ask an organization to do, which they often can do very readily, I want to emphasize that this is doable and most can do this part, express what it is they want their business to become in 3 to 5 years. And it's typically expressed in financial terms. We want to double the business. We want to grow our earnings. We want to position ourselves X, Y, and Z. So we express a capital W, H-A-T, what? It's an aspiration. We then move 90 degrees around the X matrix very carefully, and we take each one of those 3 to 5 year objectives and we articulate those in terms of the next 12 months, the near term. So what we're beginning to do is we're taking a divergent thought and we're converging, beginning to converge so that we can provide some additional focus to the plan. So we express in the west of the X matrix the 3 to 5 year in terms of the next nearmost year. Again, it's a what. I use an analogy. It's a lowercase what, lowercase W-H-A-T, but it's still an aspiration. Again, very, very clearly and readily articulated by our clients because for the most part, what's in the West is their annual operating plan or something like annual operating plan plus, if you will. Now, the real work begins. I like to say if I'm with a group facilitating a session like this and say it's a 3-day session, we're going to spend 20 to 24 hours together in conference room or meeting room settings with flip charts and data all around us. The northern part of this matrix is where the real work is done. Fully 50% of that effort by that leadership team will be spent in the north part of this matrix. And that's where we begin to translate and better articulate how is it we are going to accomplish the what aspirations that we've defined. And the transition from a what mindset into a how mindset sounds simple, but it's often very difficult. But we express in simple terms what we call annual improvement priorities. How is it we're going to set forth and accomplish what it is we set in front? And then the east, as we move the last 90 degrees in the X matrix, the east is where we define, like Nero said, really good metrics. We encourage very strong 1 or 2 quantitative metrics where we can measure over time in specific milestone posts of time. How is it we're doing with the express target setting that we've set about doing in the western part of the quadrant? The far east is where we begin the notion of accountability. Ask leadership teams, what's one of the issues that you have in a SWOT analysis? We lack accountability. Well, we're starting to put names and noses on express targets and priorities, and that begins the accountability process. And that's the X matrix in a nutshell. It doesn't solve anything. It doesn't create a robust plan, but it provides the mechanic. It provides the roadmap and the stepping stones, if you would. If a team can focus and stay focused for 3 days on something together, they can construct a consensus view of what the plan needs to be instead about the execution phase.
That's great. Great explanation. I love how you walk through these 4 quadrants, in a counter or in a clockwise.
Yeah, clockwise fashion.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really good. And, I love how you stated this transition from what to how. We're gonna come back to that in a minute.
Sure.
I'm gonna go back to,
It's the trick to the trade, if you will, how to transition.
trick okay, I think you're gonna share some tricks with us. Uh So, Nero, I want to go back to you. How often, so what Dan is describing, you're walking through, and I'm specifically talking about some of these life sciences companies, the pharmaceutical and the CDMOs that you work with. How often do you run into some of the things and difficulties, challenges that Dan talks about? What are some of the more common ones that maybe perhaps are unique to this particular industry, life sciences?
Yeah, Perry, I can say that there are maybe 4 buckets that are commonly experienced at some of the CDMOs that we have worked with. And really, the first thing I want to mention is poor operational efficiency, right? Which is where the rubber meets the road. So you can imagine if you have multiple, high-speed filling lines, and if these things are not filling the way they should, then they're not very effective in this. And we measure this by a measure called the OEE, which is the overall equipment effectiveness. And you can imagine if world class is say 95%, and if the OEE at some of these clients that we have seen to be at around 50%, which means that 50% of the time or so, you're not effectively producing product. So that's one of the bigger challenges. And, we come in there and then with excessive downtime, scrap, changeover times, we work on those types of things to make their production more efficient. The second thing is tech transfers, right? That's the other big bucket where if they don't have a well-structured process, they can consume a lot of resources and frustration when they don't launch on time and on budget. So that's the other big area of opportunity. The other area that we have seen is in the supply chain, suboptimal supply chain execution, which means that they don't have the right raw materials or components, they have excessive inventory, and their planning and scheduling processes are also broken, which means that the way we produce product is causing additional waste. And lastly, and this is probably even bigger than almost everything else I mentioned, is the lack of a management system with the proper KPIs. So what Dan was describing, the strategy deployment is working on the business. This management system is working in the business, which is really, what should the management process be, not just on the shop floor, but as we go up from the different levels, all the way from the shop floor to the executive level, what should the proper KPIs be, and what sort of discussions and challenges should we be addressing so that we are working in a well-oiled machine rather than just reacting to problems.
I want to go back to something you said earlier, which was, organizations will come to you and, "Hey, I have a problem. I think I have some operational inefficiency issues." How close are they to the problem, or are they just they just feeling a little uncomfortable? They bring you in, you help define it further, and then help solve it.
So I think what we've often seen that the folks are very well aware because it's impacting the financial performance, and they've even tried to address it themselves, but they have not been successful, and that's when they call us. And we're a type of a consulting group that not only tell you what the issues are and how to go solve it, we get into the trenches with the folks and help them achieve those results. And more importantly, how do we sustain those results? Because oftentimes companies go down the path and lose all the gains they have made. So we need to create processes through management system to make sure that we're not losing the gains that we put in place.
And then, Nero, I want to ask you something that Dan brought up was he differentiate between a behavioral issue and a technical issue. And how often is this a mixture of the two and the kind of issues you're talking about? Or is it one or the other, maybe?
I think, while the physical transformation is the easier part, it's the cultural piece that we really need to work on. And what I've heard, and this is true, is culture trumps strategy every time, right? If you don't have the right culture, and if you don't shape culture to achieve your strategy, you're going to fall flat. So when we create management systems, what we're trying to do is not do extraordinary things with extraordinary people. We try to do extraordinary things with average people. And we do that through management systems by creating leader standard work that shapes the culture to meet the objectives that we're trying to achieve.
Yeah. Yeah, really good. All right, Dan, I want to go back to something you talked about. It's that gap between the W, the what, big W, little w, and transitioning to the how. And I think you indicated that that's a challenge. That's a hard thing to do. Sounds simple in explanation, but hard to do. How do companies work? How do you work through that? And how do you help companies work through that?
Sure, Perry. It's a good question, and typically, we're generally effective at making the transition, but it does take 6, 8, 10 hours of slugging and trial and error and do over and do over. But basically, what typically happens, I have 8 to 10 to 12 executive leadership folks. I call them the Knights of the Round Table. Now, the reason I feel like they're that way, because they are the movers and the shakers, the people that can make things happen as they choose to make them happen in an organization. Now, they typically don't exercise that authority or that ability, but they do have that ability. And I'll go back to something I said before when Nero talks about how do they know, what do they know, do they recognize the issues? If you recall, the lack ofs, those same lack ofs manifest themselves even with operational issues or supply chain issues. They will tell you, I just don't have time to fix it. I don't have time or enough resources to solve it. So the same things cycle through the issues list, if you will, in an organization, whether they're trying to accomplish big ideas on the business things, or whether they're just trying to keep a lid on daily control. But let me get back to the transition from what to how. So typically what happens is a dozen people in a room. And what I ask them to do is a couple of things, and I get them out of their comfort zones. First of all, they're all in a functional role. There's the VP of operations, there's the vice president of HR, there's the legal counsel, there's the sales guy, et cetera. And what I ask them to do is shelve that role, and I want you to be, for the next 3 or 4 hours of silent brainstorming, I want you to be the chief executive officer or the only decision maker in this business. Now, we've already clearly articulated what it is we want to do. I want you to tell me in silent thought, take as long as you like. I want you to take a sticky note and write down the one thing that you think we need to do in order to accomplish that goal. And I want you to call that number one. I want you to put your name on the sticky note. So I'm beginning the process of accountability, and I'm beginning the process of critical thinking with prioritization. So I want you to give me 3 things, number 1, number 2, number 3. Now, typically the flaw in this early on is they will simply restate the objective. I'll get a sales executive say, I'm going to accomplish the AOP sales plan of 12% organic growth. That's their priority. Well, no, that's a what? Excuse me, sir, but that's a what? How is it you're going to go about doing that? And more effectively, what is wrong with your business today that is inhibiting your ability to accomplish what it is you want to do? So they have to think about what is wrong, what is missing, where's the gap? And then what we ask them to do is construct a priority statement that really begins a process thought of creating something, establishing something, putting something in place, implementing something, organizing something, et cetera, that is different tomorrow than we have in place today, because we have to do something significantly different if we're going to work on the way that we're able to execute business. So that takes some time. And I collect, as you might imagine, if there's 12 people, I ask them for a minimum of 3 priorities in a numbered fashion. I'm going to get 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 different thoughts. And then, of course, I'll collate those. Typically, they'll rack and stack onto about 35 or 40. Rack and stack meaning Nero might have an objective or a priority objective that's very similar to what I've stated in different words, but we'll stack those together as a common thought. And I'll have 35 different notions. And then I take them through that individual thought, and I take them through a collective prioritization process of scoring and rationalizing and scoring and rationalizing and disregarding and putting them back. And it's very much like a political process at that point. But again, what I typically try to get them to do is distill those 75 sticky note thoughts into 4, 5, or 6 very well expressed. How is it we're going to accomplish it? And what do we need to put in place? And make it a process thought, one that is, like we said earlier in the discussion I've had with you, Perry, try to make it evergreen. Try to make something this year through the use of the Hoshin process that can be used over and over and over again in subsequent years by putting it in process, putting it in roles and responsibilities, putting it on someone's job description, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in other words, you take on the business work in one year and you put it into in the business activities in subsequent years. And if you do that year over year over year, what you'll begin to do is you're beginning to understand that you're building a machine of accomplishment capability, a machine that can encounter, determine what to do, step forth a pathway, align resources, create timing where it doesn't exist, align resource where it currently doesn't exist, move mountains in order to accomplish the big ideas so that the teams that work in our factories, in our offices, in our warehouses can execute their roles day to day, as measured through a very good daily control system. And that's how it works. It's very simply stated, but hard to do well all the time.
I love how you describe the process, and the multiple outcomes you're able to achieve. You're very intentional about kind of setting the grounds for the next step by just having them put their name on the idea so they're held accountable.
Right.
So, yeah, so and you said you get them outside of their comfort zone. You must get some pushback initially when that happens.
Well, I get a lot of red faces, and I use levity in the room. I mean, it's not like we're trying to create anxiety in the room, but I am trying to get them uncomfortable enough to know that this is serious, that we need their best thinking, we need their focus. I make them close their laptops, I make them get off their cell phones. A lot of little techniques that we do, because the hardest part is getting them to sit still and focus. They're like mercury on a plate, as a colleague of mine say, or herding cats. I tell them, your smartest guys in the company, clearly the most accomplished people in the company, pay attention for a minute and really think about what it is we need to accomplish. That's often the most difficult thing, but again, that's cultural. As Nero says, it's clear people will damage the best plan and people will inhibit the best thinking. So that's kind of what we're trying to do. And the prioritization notion, the notion of less is more, the ability to deselect as opposed to continue to pile on initiatives, recognizing they'll never have a chance of accomplishment. They know it, but they still do it. Again, because volume translates in many of their worlds into effective leadership. It's not volume, it's effective.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about you said deselection?
Right.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, it's important, and we do a lot of this, particularly in the farmer world, because a lot of the things they do, they will tell you they are required through regulatory actions, okay? And we'll challenge those things, but we actually force an organization to lay out initiatives. We do this sometimes in a prep session before we actually go to the Hoshin, but we'll ask them to express the major initiatives that are currently ongoing and are currently resourced by the organization. And then we'll ask them a second question. If this is the initiative and this is how it's currently resourced and funded, now resource could be people, labor hours, dollars, et cetera. And then we'll ask them, to what benefit do you anticipate happening as a result of that initiative? We're going to invest $1 million and we hope to achieve $10 million of outcome, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, they list those initiatives and we do two things. Put them in priority order, not by how much investment you make, but how much outcome you get. There's another twist. It's not how much you invest, it's how much you're going to get. Squeeze, produce kind of thought. And then we'll ask them, questions like, if we add them all up, do you really have that many people here? And we do this time and time again, and the initiatives will add up to 117 people. I'm making this up. And we recognize we only have 40 people that can we devote to these tasks. So it's a point of making and letting them see for themselves. There's always this lack of. If people had infinite resources for capital and funding and headcount and staff, people pretty much could accomplish what it is they'd like to do. But the reality is that's not the case. And so what we encourage them to recognize is leadership team, you can do anything you want to do, but you cannot do everything you want to do. So what you've got to do is you've got to determine through consensus, through commitment and alignment, what do we really need? What are the must-dos? What's the critical must-do? And then can we align? Can we commit? And can we set forth leadership and resources to accomplish that? Measure it effectively and aggressively, put forth actions and make sure we do them to accomplish the goal. And it begins with a lot of anxiety. It ends with a lot of enthusiasm as they move into the first and the second and the third month of the year. Typically what happens is with 6 annual improvement priorities, 3 get to going pretty well. 1 or 2 are exceptionally effective. Always 1 or 2 are dismally ineffective. And it all goes back to the same symptoms of lack of execution.
Brilliant. As you're explaining that, I'm applying it to my own life, not just industry and manufacturing. I'm thinking, we could, if we all operated like this, we'd have a much better world.
Well, what we like to say, Nero and I both use this analogy, what we're in the business is making news, not reporting. Most organizations simply report what happened. They're not thinking about a proactive process to make news happen. So we tell them you're not victims. You're in a competitive industry where, guess what? Your competitor down the street, are they facing the same labor issues in the marketplace? Yes or no? Yes. Do they have the same capital equipment from the same OEMs? And they'll say, oh, yes, likely. Do they have the same customer base or similar customer? Yes, likely. Do they have the same supply chain or many of the same elements of the supply? And their answers are yes, yes, yes. So on what basis do we compete, team? It's how good we are. It's how good we are at orchestrating that dance, if you will. It's about us. So there are no victims. There's only people who can make things happen. And that's what we're trying to get them to recognize. Accomplishment begins with cause. Pragmatic, proactive cause. And cause are the actions that we take. The outcome or effects of what we measure. And I like to say execution is like playing golf. I love to play golf. I'm not very good at it. But every world-class golfer that I've ever heard interviewed says in interviews, I never think about the score. I think about the next shot. Yeah. I add them up at the end of the round. I never think about the score. How many times, I don't know if you play golf, you're on the 16th hole and your buddy will say, man, you're only 3 over. You're over 3 over par and you end up 12 over. Right? So again, it's about, staying in mind, keeping the goal in mind and trying to plod along. And it's a behavioral thing. It's a cultural thing. If you can get the mercury on the plate to settle down, you can get the people in the room to focus. If you can keep them aligned and committed together to pulling on the rope, it's amazing what they can accomplish.
Yeah. Awesome, awesome stuff. All right. So Nero, I'm going to go back to something. I'm going to ask you to apply all of this to the pharmaceutical industry, an example, a case study, for lack of another way of stating it. So I want to, something you brought up earlier, which is it's a core competency. It's a required core competency, which is tech transfer, especially if you're a CDMO. There's so much wasted time just trying to get things started. Can you talk about, kind of roll it all together and apply it to a CDMO trying to do tech transfer?
Yes, Barry. I think, as we discussed earlier, operational excellence, that's on your production floor is a must, right? If you don't have good operational excellence, guess what? You're not even in the game, right? And you're going to lose it, right? So that's where it starts. But then the growth comes through tech transfers, and we have to be really good at that as well. So within the tech transfer, we have already learned a lot of lessons, and that needs to be all consolidated and we need to execute, right? So I think, what it starts with having a good tech transfer process. We call it the stage gate process. And that should really outline what happens in each of those stages. And do we have the right standard work to be able to execute in those gates? So, and those things are around comprehensive planning and documentation. Imagine having a detailed tech transfer protocol, including identifying what are some of the key gaps initially, right? And doing the right risk assessment. The risk assessment is a very important piece because there's two types of ways to operate, right? Either you operate and find out that you failed, or you can think about ways you will fail and mitigate those types of risks. So risk assessment is obviously a key part of these tech transfers, including the documentation. Also, the glue that puts all this together is having robust analytical methods, which means a lab is very central to any CDMO, where raw materials and finished goods are all tested before they're released. And if that is your bottleneck, then it can seriously damage your tech transfer process as well. Also, a well-defined manufacturing process for our tech transfer is key, where we identify what are some of the key manufacturing process critical parameters. We call it in the CPPs, which is the critical process parameters, and the critical quality attributes, the CQAs. All of those have to be defined as we translate that manufacturing process, including the scale up, needs to be thought through. And then, of course, there is from the pharmaceutical company to the CDMO, effective communication and collaboration is key. Establishing, hey, what are the requirements, and what is that tech transfer going to achieve in the process? Obviously, doing all this within the quality systems and regulatory compliance is also needs to be thought through very, very well as we go about executing the tech transfer.
I want to go back to the risk assessment. You talked about risk, and a lot of times that's a uh, that's an art. There's a science, certainly a science to it, but there's also an art of seeing around corners. How does that work? What are some best practices to do that well?
Uh, One of the key things one of the tools that we use to do that is called the failure modes effects analysis, which is a way of quantifying the severity, the occurrence, and the detection of that problem. And if a cross-functional team can get together and brainstorm some of the ways that there'll be issues that may come up, we can come up and quantify, how high the risk is. And we typically have methods where if the risk exceeds a certain number, we have to come up with a way to mitigate it, especially, as it impacts uh, the patient, right, or the customer that's going to be ingesting some of these pharmaceutical ingredients that the client, the manufacturing site is going to launch.
Yeah. So getting a cross-functional team together to walk through that and just brainstorm. So you're looking at those things that have a high negative impact that could occur frequently. And you and just you I think your words were you have to do something about it.
Correct. Correct. Yeah. This is a very well. A lot of companies say they do this kind of work, but what it becomes is as you mentioned earlier, from a strategy point of view, it's just a paper exercise. If it's just that, it doesn't do any good, right? The only way it works is when people actually talk through and discuss what are the failure modes, and you got to have the right people at the table. So if manufacturing is missing from that discussion, and only the engineers are talking about it, then you may miss certain risks in the production that will later come and bite you. So it's important that we have the right people and spend a little quality time, because any upfront thinking like this saves you a huge amount of time in the back end, right? So that upfront time is well spent if we do it well.
Yeah.
So,
Dan,
Perry, let me add something to that. I mean,
yeah, go ahead, Dan.
listen to Nero talk about tech transfer specifically. everything he mentioned there is known. The art and or science of a technical transfer, the elements of that are known. It is not a creative process. Tech transfer 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. However, what we often find is they treat it as if the next tech transfer is now a new creative process, as opposed to 95% of it is repeatable to the one that we just got through, other than the details of the chemistry or whatever it is that's in the actual product that we're trying to transfer from one position to another, or in-source or outsource, or whatever the case may be. So again, the failure modes are predictable. The failure modes repeat themselves. They're not always different. I mean, they're different, but if you collate them and collect them over time, you'll find that they repeat themselves, so that you can begin to look around corners and understand it. Well, boy, the last time I went down this hallway and we took a hard left, we got hit right in the face with X, Y, and Z. So we need to make sure that we can mitigate that or anticipate that the next time. And these are the things that Nero and some of our guys that are really deep in the pharma space can help our clients with day-to-day and in higher level actions that they're taking.
Yeah. The reason I asked about tech transfer is, especially on a CDMO, when I talk to people, there's an awful lot of time lost. And, I'll put it under the onboarding.
Yeah.
There's a lot of understanding the molecule that they're going to be taking on, but
Right.
ultimately it has to be tech transferred into the facility and the work has to begin. And so when I think of the X matrix as you described it, Dan, I think of that being a long-term goal is increasing the throughput of customer projects. All of that what, but then Nero, as you explained, there's a how. We've
Yeah.
got to get better at tech transfer. So
Right.
I just think it's a great example.
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, it does have to be a core competency. I mean, the nature of that business, as we've spoken, is a lot like the fashion industry. I mean, there's new seasons, there's new stuff, there's new things all the time. So they have to be good at that dynamic environment. And if they can't adapt and make that dynamic environment an advantage, in other words, can we advantage the fact that we're dynamic and the marketplace needs dynamic, so therefore we're going to win instead of lose, then they're going to constantly struggle. Win a customer, lose a customer, win two, lose three.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the environment that we see time and time.
What a
And
painful
Barry,
existence. Yeah, go ahead, Nero. I know you wanted to add something there.
so what I want to say is, how do we tie in the strategy deployment to the execution of through the tech transfer? The reason it's called strategy deployment is because corporate may come up with a strategic AIP, which says launch 4 or 5 new products, right? Or do 5 or 6 tech transfers. That will then blow down to the site level, right? From corporate to site. That's the deployment. And the site then has to execute. And without a proper process of tech transfer, we're not going to achieve that strategic goal. So, that's how we need to make sure that we work on the processes to make sure that if we have a robust process, our execution has a better chance of success.
Yeah. I want to go back to Dan. I want to go back to you for a minute, and so I'm going to throw maybe a curveball your way. So we've been talking about the operational piece aligned with a vision, but I also hear these horror stories of business development teams bringing in customers that need projects that aren't aligned with what the company can actually do or do at a certain time. This can extend all the way into the marketing and business development realm as well, right?
Certainly. So you make a great point. The best outcomes that I've ever seen in terms of accomplishing objectives, strategic objectives, is where we remember that first lack of, and that's the alignment piece of an organization. And I break it down very simply. Every business, it's like a bicycle. It has a front wheel and has a back wheel. And oftentimes they're working at different speeds. I've seen businesses where the front wheel outruns the back, and the fulfillment teams can't fulfill what it is the front wheels can position and articulate and seize orders for. At the same time, I've seen fulfillment machines that are very, very capable and can outrun and flip the rider over the front wheels because, again, the front end is not able to accept, adapt, and articulate what it is we're capable of fulfilling. So they have to match. So for instance, if the strategic objective is to penetrate a particular aspect or market or segment, and if the sales team goes about a sale is a sale is a sale, as opposed to aligning their marketing collateral, their business development plans, their sales planning tactics, etc., their customer targets, if those are not aligned with what it is we're aligning our supply chain to be capable of doing, along with our factory and fulfillment processes in order to do, we'll have a lot of products that we produce, that we put into the marketplace that no one wants to buy, and then we'll throw them away in 2 years. And this happens a lot. There's a word for that. It's called obsolescence. So again, that dysfunction of the front wheel and the back wheel is a very important step to take for alignment. Let's get aligned, guys. So bounce that out, battle those arguments together, and then come out with consensus. Let's make sure that we got somebody to cover this flank and this particular, because it's a multifaceted environment. If we're going to win the war, not only do we have to win this battle, we got to do a lot of different things at the same time. And they use the old term, we got to walk and chew gum. And walking and chewing gum is a lot what a CEO has to do. He has to constantly align his organization. And that's where deselection comes in. A sales team will say, well, let's go here. And he'll say, no, I don't want to go there. And I'll say, yes, I want to go there. And he'll say, no, we don't want to go there. Well, then finally someone has to say, team, we're not going to go there. The answer is not no. The answer is no, not now. And in the next 12 to 18 months, this is what we're going to build capability to do. This is what we're going to execute. And this is what we're going to measure to accomplish. And then therefore we can win. We can do, like I said, we can do anything we want to do. Can't do everything.
Can do it everyone.
Yeah, great stuff. Everything's integrated. I love how you come all the way back to everything that's come up today. What a great discussion, gentlemen. Thank you very much for taking out the time and being with the Trailblazers today. I've been talking to Dan Sullivan and Nero Haralalka. They are from TBM Consulting Group. Nero, how can our audience get a hold of you? How can they find you?
Yeah, so there's multiple ways. We are on LinkedIn. We are also have our website. I'd say that if they can reach us through the tbmcg.com website. They should be able to put an inquiry through that, and we'll respond to that, obviously. So,
All right. You'll unfurl your capes and fly in. Gentlemen, thank you very much. It's been great having you on the Trailblazers.
Thank you.
thanks, Barry. Thanks.
Bye.